Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly class, Ethics of the Fathers. We're up to Chapter 2, Mishnah 5. This is a continuation of the teachings of Hillel, the famous sage whose teachings were already mentioned in Chapter 1, and then it went through his descendants, and once again in Chapter 2 the author of Ethics of the Fathers picks up with Hillel. And one of his basic teachings in the previous Mishnah was that you have to not separate yourself from the community, be part of a community. And a lot of what he said there seems to revolve around our communal responsibilities. This Mishnah, it seems that he's now focused on personal growth in terms of our knowledge. Because you can be part of a community, but if you don't have your own integrity, your own scholarship, your own wisdom, you're not going to be very much capable of contributing to the community. And this is what he used to say. When it says he used to say, means literally, it's not something he said once or twice, but it's something he would repeat over and over again. And we find this amongst some of the greatest scholars and leaders of the Jewish people, that they didn't always have to be original. They didn't always have to say something novel, which they did, of course. But very often they would repeat certain teachings over and over again. And they never got tired from emphasizing those teachings. And of course, we shouldn't get tired hearing them. Because it's not just knowing these teachings, it's inculcating them, it's instilling them, and having them become part of our conscissness. So here he's talking about learning, it seems, mostly learning. And he used to say the following, and they put their I don't know why they translated it different from other translations. A brood is not sin-fearing. The Hebrew word here is Boor. And in the English, of course, we have the word Boor. So it's very likely that the Hebrew was the source of the English word Boor, which comes from other languages, but originally it was a Hebrew word. And I just want to get off the subject a little bit because I think it's fascinating. Modern day linguistics will not attribute anything to Hebrew. Nothing comes from Hebrew. Hebrew is some ancient language and it evolved on its own, but it's nothing to do with modern languages. I have a book over here called The Word, which has a few thousand words in English and in other languages that originate in Hebrew. And one of the words is the word Boor, B-O-R-E, to bore. It says in Hebrew, the word for a pit is Boor. And the word, he doesn't even mention that, I don't know why he doesn't mention this, the word for a boor that we use in English is a boor in Hebrew as well. So that word, that English word, which comes from earlier languages, it could be, very likely, originates in Hebrew. And he has so many other words. In fact, the word source, what's the Hebrew word for source? Shoresh. The word for regular is ragil. There's so many, those are just some of the very blatant examples, but there are so many other examples that it's clear that Hebrew had a much greater influence on the shaping of other modern languages, much more than they'll give credit to. They will give credit to certain words that were borrowed from biblical terms, like Jubilee is a Yovel is the Hebrew, so the English turned it into Jubilee. Amen is Amen in Hebrew. So there are certain words that they'll acknowledge comes from the Hebrew, And that was because probably of the King James translation of the Bible, where they took certain Hebrew words and translated them, so they became standard in English as well. But it's fascinating that the Hebrew word for a boor is boor. Ein boor yirei chet. A boor cannot be someone who fears sin. Now, what is the definition of a boor, at least in the Hebrew? And the Hebrew term boor is used in agriculture. In agriculture, if you have a field that you don't plow, you don't sow, you don't cultivate, that field is called a field boor, a boor field. Why is it boor? Because it has nothing. It doesn't have any ability to grow. It stays in one place.
May I ask you a question? Boor is a seed, right? Or a pit, you said. Did I misunderstand it?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
But the word boor, a field that's boor, is a field that has nothing to offer. And that's the reference to a human being who seems to be a totally empty human being, has nothing to offer, doesn't stand for anything. Commentaries point out he's ignorant to the laws of Torah, it's just a person who has no interest in anything of any intellectual basis. Someone who doesn't get involved even in business. To be involved in business, you have to use business acumen, you have to use some intelligence, doesn't have any interest in anything that requires intelligence. That person cannot be a fear of sin, probably, as commentaries point out, because he doesn't have any knowledge. Because even if a person doesn't study Torah, they'll still pick up knowledge from the culture in which they live. People deal in business, so they talk about what's ethical, what's unethical. People learn about what's right and what's wrong from just being part of life, experiencing life. But if a person doesn't do anything, maybe the equivalent nowadays would be someone who all they do is bowling or playing tennis or playing golf. That's all they do. There's nothing else in their life. And I'm not disparaging tennis or golf or bowling. Recreation has a place in Jewish life. But if that's all they stand for, then they're not going to have any knowledge of what's right and what's wrong. They won't even pick up things by osmosis that would give them some measure of decency. So they don't fear sin. They don't realize what they're doing could be wrong. That's one way of looking at it. The Hebrew word for a pit is boor. It's spelled a little differently, boor, or boor. But in Hebrew, when you write Hebrew without vowels, they're identical, boor and boor. And some say that that's the definition of a boor. A boor is a person who is a boor, an empty pit. What's an empty pit? Where do we find the reference to an empty pit in the Torah? Joseph. They threw Joseph into the pit, and the pit was empty, it had no water in it. And our sages tell us, obviously if it's empty, it has no water, it's redundant. So the Talmud says, no, it didn't have water in it, but it had snakes and scorpions. It's a nice place to be. They threw Joseph into that pit with snakes and scorpions, and miraculously he was not affected. He wasn't hurt by them. But what is the deeper meaning of all that is that when you're in an empty pit, there's no water. Water is a symbol of life. It gives life. When there's no life, you're empty. You open yourself up to snakes and scorpions, to harmful influences. You can't just be neutral. There's no such thing as neutrality in life. Either you're doing the right thing or you're doing the wrong thing. You can't just say, I'm just going to be neutral. I'm not going to get involved in right or wrong. I'm just going to be neutral. You can't be neutral, because if you're empty, which is what neutral could mean, then you're going to be opening yourself to all sorts of harmful influences. I like to dabble in Gematria, in numerology. The word boor or boor adds up to 208. And everyone knows what 208 is. No, you don't all know what 208 is? Holy kidding. It's not a very common, what?
Very boor, so we don't know.
You're not a Boor, no. If you're here in this class, you can't be a Boor. We have a big sign there, no Boors allowed. But 208 is the Gematria, the numerical value of two very important biblical figures, Yitzchak, the second patriarch, Isaac, Yitzchak, and Pinchas. Both of these shared certain traits. But before I go into the shared trait, what does Yitzchak mean? Yitzchak is in the future. He will laugh. What that means in down-to-earth terms is certain people want to enjoy life, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they do that at the expense of their future. People engage in certain types of behavior that are detrimental in the long run, but they're enjoyable in the short run. And the person will sacrifice their future for temporary, instant gratification. Yitzchak is someone, the model of Yitzchak is someone who represents working for the future. So a person who chooses not to work, person who chooses not to do anything of substance, that's a person who lives in the present and ignores the future, and therefore has no sense of what's important, has no value system. That's the idea of Yitzchak. Pinchas also represents the future, because Pinchas, when he committed an act of zealousness, of zealotry, a yud was added to his name. You can spell Pinchas with a yud or without a yud. Originally it was spelled without a yud, and when he defended the Jewish people, I'm not going to go into the whole story, the whole graphic story, but a yud was added to his name, and the yud in Hebrew makes a word into future, like in the word Yitzchak. Tzchok is laughter. Yitzchak means he will laugh. So Pinchas also represents someone who sees the future. He sees that the present people engage in certain types of behavior, and he realizes that that behavior is destructive and detrimental, and he focuses on the future. So Boor has the same numerical value as Yitzchak and Pinchas. What's the significance of that? When two words have the same numerical value, what does that point to? It points to the fact that they're connected. And there are two ways of being connected to something. One is positive, and one is negative. And not just negative, by diametrically opposite. For example, the word Mashiach adds up to 358. The word Nachash, serpent, which is the symbol of evil, it started off the whole process of evil, is also 358. Does that mean that Mashiach is a serpent? No, it means Mashiach is the opposite of the serpent, and ultimately he will transform the evil into positive. Same thing over here. Boor is a person who is the opposite of Yitzchak, the opposite of someone who focuses on the future. And the ultimate goal is to transform that person into someone who has substance, to turn the Boor into a Be'er. In Hebrew, it's very interesting. If you take the word Boor, and instead of the Vav in the middle of it, which is really a vowel, and you put an Aleph, it turns into Be'er. Be'er is a hole also. It's a hole in the ground, but a hole filled with water. Of living, refreshing waters. So the opposite of the Boor is the Be'er. And this is also true about many words. If you put an Aleph into it, it transforms the word from one extreme to the other extreme. For example, the word for exile is Gola. The word for redemption is Geula. They're both spelled the same way, with the exception that Geula, redemption, has an Aleph in it. The letter Aleph is a very powerful letter. The word Aleph, the letter Aleph, means a few things. The letter Aleph could mean, it can mean teaching, it can mean master. It represents God as the master of the world. It represents God as the teacher of the world. And it also, if you rearrange the letters, spells Pella, the wonders, the mystery of the world. But that's a separate subject. So the opposite of Boor is Be'er. You take the dead ground of the Boor, or the Boor. Either way, both words mean similar ideas of emptiness, vacuousness, something that has no substance, and you turn that into refreshing waters.
May I ask, is the pit, if you plant a pit and it grows, is that not also something that comes to fruition in the future?
If you plant a pit, right, but a field that's called Boor is one that wasn't planted. So it's the opposite, it has no life in it. And no sensitivity. What is the definition of life? You're sensitive to stimuli. A dead body isn't sensitive. A living body is sensitive. A person who's a Boor is a person who's insensitive, who nothing registers as being important or something of being detrimental. They just don't feel. They have no feeling. Just like, God forbid, if a person has a physical ailment, they don't feel pain. If you don't feel pain, it's not a blessing, it's a curse. Why? Because a person could go through a very destructive medical issue and they don't feel it, so they don't do anything to treat it. Pain is a positive thing. It's a gift that God gives people, that they can feel pain. And just like there's physical pain, there's also spiritual pain. There's also feeling uncomfortable with something that's unethical, immoral. A Boor is someone who doesn't have that sensitivity, doesn't feel any pain. They're not sensitive. Now it says he can't be sin-fearing. What is the meaning of sin-fearing? Simple meaning is he doesn't care about sin. He doesn't feel sensitive. It's like an animal. It can step on a rock, and it can step on a baby. It doesn't know the difference between one and the other. A person who's a Boor doesn't understand the difference between something that has value and something that doesn't have value. But there's a deeper meaning of yirei chet, fear of sin. The word chet in Hebrew is also often translated, as it does here, as sin. But there are several words in Hebrew that mean sin. The word chet usually refers to an unintentional transgression, something that person did unintentionally. Why do people do bad things unintentionally? Because they lack sensitivity. So it's not someone who is a violent criminal who wants to hurt other people, or someone who's so tempted with all sorts of illegal temptations. Those are intentional things. Chet is not an intentional thing. Chet is someone who is insensitive and therefore does things without even realizing it. Like someone will do things not realizing how it's harming someone, and it didn't even occur to them. Now, which is worse, when you want to hurt someone intentionally, you want to hurt someone, or you don't want to hurt someone intentionally, but you do anyhow? Which is worse? Intentional. And the answer is yes. The answer is that it depends. Everything in Judaism, if you ever get someone to ask you a question, if you want to be safe, you have to say it depends. You'll always be right. It depends in what we're talking about. Yes, of course, an intentional sin is worse than an unintentional one. But in a certain sense, an unintentional one demonstrates that you have no sensitivity. An intentional one means that you had a struggle. The part of you, your Yetzer Tov, your good inclination said, don't hit, don't smack the person. And your Yetzer Hara, your evil impulse says, smack him. And you had a struggle. Should I do it or not? And your Yetzer Hara was victorious. You win battles and you lose battles. But when you smack someone unintentionally, because it didn't even occur to you that there was someone there that you could harm, that means that it's ingrained in you. That the negative is ingrained in you, that you just do it almost automatically. You don't even have to think about it. And that's harder to expunge. It's easier to get a person to rehabilitate from doing things that are bad when they know they're doing something consciously. But if you do something unconsciously, that means it's more part of you. I'm going to give you an example. In the Talmud, there's a law that you're not allowed to insult someone and cause them embarrassment. It's a form of bloodshed. Call them by a name, a nickname that's embarrassing. But what about if the person doesn't get embarrassed anymore? It's still a crime. Because the reason they don't get embarrassed is not because it's not embarrassing to them, but the shame has so become ingrained in them, they don't even feel it anymore. You damage them so badly that they can't feel it. And that's much worse than when you hurt someone's feelings and it bounces off them, no big deal. But if it becomes internalized within them, that's a much more serious form of harm to another person. So the Yirei Chet, the person who fears sin, is someone who naturally is repulsed by the sin. It doesn't mean they won't do anything wrong. They might commit a crime. They might do something tempting because they lost the battle. But they're not going to just, without forethought, just allow themselves to do things that are harmful because they're too sensitive to allow that to happen. Another definition of the word chet in Hebrew, and this is the simple meaning of the word, doesn't mean sin at all. It means falling short of the mark. It's used, if you shoot an arrow and it misses the target, that was a chet. It's not a sin to miss the target. It means it fell short of the mark. When someone has a mission and has a purpose, and they fall short of their purpose, they're called chet. That's called a chet. And the Boor is someone who doesn't understand what the mark is. Always falls short of the mark because it's not motivated, but it has no goal. The only goal, to use a Buffalo example, is the Bills scoring. That's the only goal they're interested in. But they have no other goals in life. When you have no other goals in life, you're always going to fall short of the goal, missing the mark. And that person, that's the Boor that you have to realize is a very destructive person who doesn't have the ability to change. Even when it comes, yes?
Your definition of chet also applies to Pirkei Avot. In the Aleph we say...
Good question. We use the term for the golden calf, chet ha'egel, the sin of the golden calf. But you use the word there as chet, not the other words for sin, avon, pesha, but chet, which is usually understood to be unintentional. And the answer to that is that the reason why they worshipped a golden calf was it was so ingrained in them, the idea of idolatry, that it just came out without even thinking about it. It was an obvious. You have to remember, 40 days before this, they hear God Himself speak. The only time in history where the whole nation hears God speak, God says, "Don't have any other gods." And 40 days later, they're going to create a molten image, a graven image, an idol made a calf, an idolatrous calf made out of gold. It doesn't make sense. It's just totally illogical. How does a nation that heard God Himself speak so degenerate in 40 days? And the answer is idolatry in Egypt was so ingrained in them that it became like almost an automatic thing. When Moses is gone, we have to create another God. It wasn't all the Jews anyhow. It was just mostly one grouping, and the rest of the people didn't do anything to stop it. That's why they were all blamed. Most were blamed. But the people who did it, it was so ingrained in them. So it was a chet. It was something that, even though it was intentional, it was like unintentional because it was ingrained in them.
The ones who did it, were those the predecessors of the spies?
What do you mean by predecessors?
The ancestors of what became the spies?
No, they were totally different people. The people who did it were all died. All the golden calf perpetrators all died, and the spies were a separate group of people. One came on the heels of the other. They were not so far removed. The golden calf was created on the 17th of Tammuz, and the spies came back on Tisha B'Av, which is 3 weeks later, but not the same year. It was the next year.
Did Hashem actually make the egel?
It was a miracle that it came out. Yeah, but they had intention.
Miracles or something?
Okay, that gets into a whole different subject about the golden calf. We'll stay here for the next few days if we have to exhaust everything about the golden calf. Now, it says in the Talmud, this is just another reinforcement of what I was just saying, that even the sinners of Israel, and the word for sin there means rebellious sin, are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. That even if you look at a Jew who's really a rotten, evil, malicious Jew, he is filled with mitzvahs the way a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Why is that? Because his rebelliousness is actually a positive sign that there's something stirring in him or her. The Jew is born with a rebellious spirit. To rebel, what is that?
We stiff-necked people.
To rebel against evil. That's the nature that we were given. But we could use it, we have free choice. We can take any gift that God gives us and use it for the good or use it for the evil. So what happens with a rebellious Jew, he's taking that God-given gift of rebelliousness and using it for something bad. So that what's going on in him or her is something positive. And therefore the negative is on the surface, is external, is peripheral. But the person who's the Boor, there's nothing going on inside. Of course, even the Boor has something positive. There's no question that there's no such thing as someone who doesn't have something positive. But it's so deeply ingrained that in a certain way he's inferior to the rebel, to the rebellious Jew.
He's the one who doesn't know to ask, to pass over the 4 questions. He's the one who doesn't know to ask.
You could make that association. There is one interpretation that makes that association, that the 4 sons, the one who doesn't even know how to ask, why is that son the last? The Rasha, the evildoer should be the last. No, the evildoer is rebelling. But the one who can't ask, the reason he doesn't know how to ask is because he doesn't care. He's indifferent. And you know the famous joke, they ask someone, which is worse, ignorance or indifference? And he says, I don't know and I don't care. So that's the one who doesn't know how to ask questions. He doesn't know because he doesn't care. So that's one interpretation of that. There are many other interpretations. In fact, there's even an interpretation that he's the highest of the 4 sons. The one who doesn't ask questions because he transcends questions. But that's for Pesach. We'll leave that for Pesach.
That's where the Yud and Aleph added.
What?
That's where the Yud and Aleph added to that.
Yeah. So that's the Boor. But then we get to a one level higher. Nor is an ignorant person pious. Now, what do we mean by an ignorant person? Someone who's not, this is the way most commentators understand this, someone whose knowledge of Torah is very scant, is very limited. But the person is involved in other types of endeavors. Someone who lives in a society and contributes to society. So even though they don't contribute to the teachings of Torah, but they have some substance, they have some knowledge, and some degree of sensitivity. So they could certainly be yirei chet. They could fear sin. They can fear being short of the mark. They can be sensitive to things. Even though they're not really scholars of Torah, but nevertheless they have some substance. But they can't be a chassid. The Hebrew word here is chassid. What does the word chassid mean? Now we use the word chassid for a member of a certain sociological grouping of Jews who follow a Hasidic leader. But the word chassid is a biblical word. And the word means someone who goes beyond the law. Actually, the Hebrew term is not beyond the law, but within the law. It goes deeper beneath the surface. It's not just satisfied with, what does the law require of me? A, B, and C. No, he goes beyond the A, B, and C to do even more because he knows the soul, the spirit of the law. And very often, Jews were criticized by the breakaway religion that we're focused on the letter of the law. They believe in the spirit of the law. But of course that's a canard, that's false, a false criticism, because we believe in both. We believe that a human being is a physical being, and therefore we have to translate our feelings into physical actions. That's the underlying rationale for many of the commandments, according to the Chinuch, a medieval commentator on the 613 commandments. But we also believe in the spirit of the law, not just doing the actions, but penetrating beneath the surface to to know what the Spirit is and apply it to situations that the law doesn't cover, and do more than what the law, go beyond that, whether it's in mitzvahs that relate to our relationship with God, whether it's our relationships with other people. We can get away with a bare minimum, and we could say to ourselves, we follow the law. Now, when it comes to certain things, and let's say secular law, there's no mitzvah to go beyond the law. The IRS said I should give my paltry salary of $10 million. I should give only $1 million to taxes. Now, I want to give $2 million. No, there's no mitzvah to give more money to taxes, because if you have more money to give to taxes, give it to charity, because you know that it'll go for a charitable purpose. You don't know what the government is going to use the money for. So we pay taxes because we live in this government. We're obligated by Jewish law to pay our taxes, but we don't have to be pious. We don't have to go beyond the requirements of the law. But when it comes to helping other people, in terms of giving charity, yes, you can satisfy your obligation with a bare minimum, but you should always endeavor to do more. And charity is not just money, it's whatever you can do to help someone. So the...
from the Shorish kindness?
Yes. The root of chassid is chesed, kindness, because kindness means that you're not just doing it because you are required to do it, you're doing it because you have a feeling for it. You want to be kind to God, kind to your fellow.
And there's no limit to kindness.
That's right. Now, what is the definition of Am HaAretz? If you translate it literally, Am HaAretz means a nation of the earth. But it came to mean an ignorant person, a person who was not sophisticated. There's a story in the Midrash. A certain Am HaAretz, actually it uses the Aramaic term, Amma Da'ara. Certain Am HaAretz came to a rabbi whose name was Hoshia, and he said to him, I have a nice Dvar Torah, a nice comment on the Torah. Would you teach this teaching in public in my name? And Rabbi Hoshia said, yes, sure, let me hear what you have to say. So his Dvar Torah was that Jacob, when he came to meet his brother Esav, he didn't know if Esav was going to still hate him and want to kill him, or maybe he had forgiven him. So he prepared himself, he prayed, he was prepared to fight a battle if need be, and also he gave him a very elaborate gift. So this Am HaAretz had a commentary, and he based it on a Psalm 72, that it says that the nations will return the gifts to Mashiach. In the Messianic age, the nations of the world, he said, it doesn't say we'll give gifts to Mashiach, we'll return them. That all the gifts we gave Esav, we're going to get back. Esav and his heirs will return it to us. So whatever we contribute to the nations of the world in the Messianic age, we'll get it back. Would you please say this teaching in my name? And Rabbi Hoshia agreed, and he publicized it. So the question is, what was going on over here between, and why does the Midrash emphasize he was an Am HaAretz, he was an ignoramus? We don't like to throw around bad demeaning titles to people. What relevance does it have to the story? He could have just said, a Jew came to the rabbi, said, I have a nice Dvar Torah, I have a nice teaching, could you say it in my name? Why to label him an Am HaAretz? So there's a commentary that explains it very beautifully. He says it's not that he was an ignorant person, but he was coming to the subject of Mashiach, of the Messianic age, from a perspective, from an earthly perspective. What is the earthly perspective? Why should someone want Mashiach? We pray for it 3 times every day, and the Talmud says when a person leaves this world and he's put in judgment, the first thing that he's asked is, were you honest in your business? That's the first question. And the second question is, did you wish for, did you anticipate, did you yearn for the Mashiach, for the Messianic age, for the coming of Mashiach and the redemption? In other words, that's something that every Jew has an obligation to pray for the future, that the world will become a better world, and a world which we call the world of Mashiach, the Messianic age, which will be ushered in by Mashiach, by a human being, a great Jewish leader. So there are two ways. How do you develop a yearning for something? If I tell you, I want you to yearn for a certain food, I want you to want it. I want you to crave that food. He said, I never heard of that food. How could I crave it? You can't. I can't order you to crave for something you know nothing about or you don't care for. So how does the Torah tell us, for example, to love God? It's a commandment to love God. If you already love Him, you don't need the commandment. If you don't love Him, how could you command someone? I want you to love me, but I don't love you. How could you command someone to love someone if you don't love them? The answer is that the commandment is not to love God. The commandment is to meditate and learn about God and meditate on God. And when you get to know God in some limited way, you develop a feeling for God, a feeling of love, a feeling of reverence. Same thing over here. How do you want Mashiach? The answer is you can't want Him. You have to develop an understanding of what He represents and what the Messianic age will bring. So there are two perspectives. One perspective is the perspective of the Am HaAretz, the earthly perspective, that Mashiach will give us gifts. The nations of the world will return all the gifts that we gave them, and we will all benefit from that bounty. That's a materialistic motivation for Mashiach. And that's what this Am HaAretz was asking of Rabbi Hoshia. What does Hoshia mean? The name Hoshia. God will be, either God will save or God will be saved. Which means that why do we want Mashiach? We can want Him because of earthly considerations, because of materialistic benefits, of physical benefits. There'll be no more illness. There'll be abundance of everything that we want and anything we could care for. We'll have everything. Things will grow on trees. Every benefit you can think of, we will have. And the nations of the world will return all the gifts to us. That's all great. But that's very materialistic. Hoshia means we want Mashiach because God Himself is in exile. God Himself suffers. It says in the Talmud and Midrash, when the Torah says God will return your captives, the Hebrew there doesn't really mean He will return the captives, but He will return with the captives. That God Himself is concealed. God wants, what does God want? Why did He create this world? He wants a world in which He can be revealed, in which everyone is aware of His presence. Exile is where God's presence is totally obscured. So Hoshia means He wants Mashiach because He wants, so to speak, to save God, to make sure that God gets redeemed from the exile that God Himself is incarcerated in.
Save God for each person to recognize God.
But everyone should recognize God, yes. So this Am HaAretz, this materialistic Jew, says, I don't know if you, Rabbi, you want to say my Dvar Torah because you're so much more sophisticated. Will you accept and legitimize and validate my approach, which is a materialistic approach? Is it all right for a Jew to say, God, I don't know too much about God, I don't know too much about spirituality, I'm a down-to-earth materialistic person, and I want Mashiach because life will be better for me. I'll get a better job, I'll be happier, and everything will be great. I'll be healthy, and that's wonderful. Is that sacrilegious? Is that an abomination? Is there anything wrong with that? And Rabbi Hoshia says, no, absolutely not. I will mention what you said, and I will say it in your name, because that's also legitimate. If a Jew wants something positive, even if it's not for the most sophisticated reason, it is positive.
Isn't that a validation?
Yes, he validated it. And the Rebbe once explained the words of Maimonides. Maimonides says that when Mashiach comes, all the delights will be like the dust of the earth. What does Maimonides mean? What is he trying to tell us? So the Rebbe says he's giving us two messages. To the unsophisticated, he's saying, you like delights, physical delights, you like candy, like ice cream, or whatever adult version there is of those things, you'll have all of it as long as it's kosher. You'll have all of the greatest delights in the world. If you're more sophisticated, they're going to be worthless. They're going to be meaningless. They'll be like dust of the earth. You're not going to care for those things. So the Rambam is describing the future in ways that appeals to both classes, to the HaAretz class and to the Hoshia class. Let me just finish the thought before I forget what I was going to say. And the common denominator there is whatever it takes to get a Jew to want Mashiach is kosher, short of committing a crime. Someone could say, you know what, if I become so evil, Mashiach will have no choice. He'll have to come to save me. Now that you can't do. You can't commit a crime to get Mashiach to come. But you could use even a materialistic, even the HaAretz is legitimate. Yes?
When you use the word HaAretz, I'm curious, my Hebrew is very poor, so why the Ha? Why not HaAretz? Why HaAretz?
A nation of the earth.
Isn't HaAretz Israel?
Sometimes it is, and not necessarily.
So
when you say Aretz and you're talking about the special land, it's Israel, obviously, but the word Aretz, it's used also.
HaAretz, then when you're talking about a simple person.
Aretz means nation earth. You have to have the nation of the earth.
I'm just confused because I thought HaAretz was Israel.
Not necessarily, no. And it's true in every area of Judaism. There are two perspectives. There could be more than two, but at least two. There's a down-to-earth perspective, how we see the reality of Torah from the perspective of the earth, from our own limited perspectives. And then there's someone who comes from a much higher perspective, who's looking from the top down. What's the difference between a holy person and a regular person? Why does Judaism put such a focus on going to righteous people and for their blessing? And because they're like standing on the top of a mountain. They have a different vision. They see things in a different way. They see things from the top down. We see things from the bottom up, but we don't always see things the way they are. Sometimes things happen and we question, why is God doing this? Why is this happening? Because we can only see things from our perspective, from our earthly perspective. That's the HaAretz. So the HaAretz is not a bad guy. It's just someone who has a down-to-earth perspective. And that's legitimate. But if you want to be a chassid, if you want to go beyond, if you want to get to the deeper aspects, you have to have a more spiritual perspective. You have to be from a higher perch and looking from that perch down into this world. Just an illustration of this. Before the Rebbe became Rebbe, his father-in-law was the Rebbe. And there were a group of Hasidim who had a certain project that they wanted to establish. I don't know what it was. It was not mentioned. And they asked the Rebbe, who was then the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, to join them in their venture and to approach the Rebbe, who was then the Rebbe, for his endorsement of this idea. And by the time after they got together and they formulated the plan and everything to get it ready to bring to the Rebbe's attention, the Rebbe passed away. The previous Rebbe passed away. So now the Hasidim came to his successor, the Rebbe, who was one who spearheaded that effort, and they said, let's do it now. You're now in charge. And he said, no, we're not going to do it. And they asked him, why not? You spearheaded this effort before. He says, now I see things from a different perspective. Once he became the Rebbe, he was endowed with a different spiritual perspective, and he can see things differently. And from that perspective, he realized that was not the best idea. So you can be either coming from one perspective or another, but it's not just, you don't have to be a Rebbe. Every one of us has to try to go away from being just an HaAretz to see things from a more spiritual perspective. Any questions? Any questions on Zoom? Okay, so the other half of the Mishnah we'll have to do next week, God willing.
And I wanted to let you know that that actor on the left who plays the Jewish person in the movie is a Jewish convert, and his name is John Goodman, and he himself is not Jewish.
I thought you said he is Jewish.
In the movie, the character he plays,
Oh,
this character is Jewish. This is John Goodman, but he himself is not Jewish.
oh, but in the movie he's
In the
Jewish.
movie, he plays a Vietnam veteran whose wife asked him to convert to Judaism. So it's Shomer Shamus in the role.
Oh, okay.
Say Yiddish, HaAretz is the
I have a
dark.
question.
If you call someone an HaAretz nowadays, it's an insult. Yes. Yeah, it does. It could be a pejorative, but it could be. It could be a person who's an agricultural expert, an agronomist.
No, we call the guy an agronomist. Barren is the Mishnah term.
Which word?
Barren.
Yeah, I have a question, Rabbi.
Once, yeah. Yes. What's your question?
My question is,